Greetings, creatures of the night. Don't forget, my novel, The Griffin Chronicles, Volume 1, is available on Amazon.com. The link to that book is in the description below. Don't miss your chance to read it. It's available on Kindle, paperback, and hardcover. I would love to hear what you guys think about my book. And remember, don't miss your chance to scream. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow, black. They see me and pierce me. His wet hand. I will not sleep. Of course, as many of you know, this guy is talking about the Rake. This entry comes from a journal that was translated from Spanish to English and is dated in 1880. Or so the legend says. You see, there's a clear divide between the people when it comes to the existence of the Rake. Many people believe it's an actual entity. Whether that means corporeal or spiritual is still out for debate. Many other people will tell you that the origins of the Rake date back to 2005 on the Fortune board by an anonymous poster. This thread was simply titled, "Hey, let's make a new monster." Like the Slenderman tales, the internet takes credit for its creation, and skeptics will be the first to point out that the Rake just doesn't exist. There are tons of creepypastas about both of these entities. Both of them have only been brought into light pretty recently too, so the chance that these two entities are just hoaxes is definitely a possibility. But what if the Rake just being a creepypasta is a cover-up? What if there are people out there dedicated to keeping the existence of monsters like this a secret? If you dig a little further into the Rake phenomenon, you'll find out that YouTube channels and message boards that offered proof of the Rake actually existed and were shut down without any warning or explanation, and most accounts of this creature have since been destroyed. Of course, there are plenty of hoaxes out there too, which just complicates the argument for both sides. In 2010, a picture of a character named Grimm from a video called Resistance 3 surfaced, and tons of people assumed that this was a real image of the Rake. A hunter claimed that he took a picture in the woods while hunting and that it was actually something that he encountered. Later, it was confirmed to be a hoax. There are also thousands of pictures on DeviantArt claiming to be real pictures of the Rake. The skeptics will tell you that even the backstory of the Rake, including reports of the creature from the 1600s, are all part of this intricate hoax that the creators of the monster made up, just to make it seem more believable. That report from 1690 is allegedly from a mariner and reads, "He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed, I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again at the request of the Rake." Now, personally, I don't know if the Rake is real, made up, or just a case of mistaken identity of some other monster that people like to run into, like skinwalkers, fleshgates, wendigos. What I do know is this: I don't ever want to find out myself, and there really are things out there that go bump in the night. We all know that. We just don't know if the Rake is one of them. On this channel alone, there's dozens of encounters with things that sound remarkably similar to the Rake. I've heard stories of people being stalked inside and outside of their homes. Tall humanoid-looking creatures that instill a sense of fear like nothing else have been stalking people since the beginning of mankind. And stories of these type of creatures date back before we even had written accounts. But my opinion on whether or not this thing is real doesn't matter. I'm here to tell you the facts of what eyewitnesses claim to have seen, and then I'll let you decide for yourself. If you're one of those unfortunate souls that have had an encounter with something like this, my heart and prayers are with you. Just know you're not alone. Other people have experiences just like yours. And if you want to talk about them, you can always reach out to me. You can message me here on this episode, or you can email me, thesupernaturalist13@gmail.com. So here's what we know what the Rake is supposed to be. It's humanoid, has pale gray skin that at times seems wet. It has two big, hollow, black eyes that can pierce right through you. No nose, a small mouth filled with hundreds of dull teeth. It can give the person encountering it a range of emotions, anywhere from a childlike wonder to absolute undiluted fear. The rake has also been described as having an unnatural body position, twisted and deformed, like it was hit by a car or something. History of the rake says that during the summer of 2003, northeastern United States citizens were coming into contact with this strange humanoid creature that would stalk them from the shadows and eventually try to make contact with them. That's when they started looking for answers and contacting the media. The rake received so much media coverage that a blackout was enacted and no one was allowed to report on this creature. Lore about the rake says this: the rake chooses its next victim when someone accidentally encounters it. Usually when the encounter happens, it's somewhere out of the way. Most of the time it's at night, and the rake just stares that person down. Maybe it's taking an imprint of that person, or memorizing their scent. Who knows? Within a few nights though, the rake gets inside their house, and they wake up to see the monster staring at them from the foot of their bed. After that, the rake visits frequently. Victims of the rake that aren't killed or driven insane usually end up taking their own lives. There's an alleged suicide note from 1964 that says this: "As I prepare to take my own life, I feel it necessary to ease any guilt or pain that I have introduced through this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him. For once I awoke, I felt his presence. And once I awoke, I saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awaken to. I can never wake. Goodbye." When the rake attacks people, it's unknown. Some people think it feeds on flesh. Some others think it feeds on negative fears or feelings. There's an encounter that was featured in Monsters and Mysteries of America. It took place in Erie, Pennsylvania. A girl named Carrie snuck outside of her dorm room one night at a boarding school that she was going to. She met up with her boyfriend, and soon after, they witnessed the rake in the distance. It approached them, ready to attack, but ran off when the school proctor arrived on the scene. After that, she witnessed the rake one more time when it entered her dorm room, but it once again ran off when her dorm mate woke up. Carrie is certain that she'll encounter the rake again one day, but she doesn't let that looming sense of dread ruin her life. In fact, she has a small tattoo that represents the rake as a reminder to live her life to the fullest. Rake attacks normally happen at night. In fact, I haven't come across one attack during the day in all of my research or the encounters that people have sent to me. What isn't clear is whether they're capable of attacking in the corporeal world, the spiritual world, or both. One thing that's certain: if these attacks are factual, the rake ruins the lives of people that encounter it and their families. One of the most documented encounters talks about of a woman who lost her husband and child after they encountered the rake in 2006. And this is what she wrote. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip from Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids right to bed and we called it a night. About 4 a.m., I woke up thinking that my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he got out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly his knee almost knocked me out of bed. Then he grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for half a second, I was able to see what caused this strange reaction from him. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large, hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into a fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around the side of the bed, and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of motion right along the bed until it was less than a foot from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds. Or probably closer to 5. It just seemed like a while. And it was just staring at him. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway, leading to the kids' room. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop him before he hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouching and hunched about 20 feet away. He turned and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped on the switch on the wall and saw my daughter Clara. The creature ran down the stairs while my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured, and spoke only once more in her short life. She said, "He is the Rake." My husband drove his car into a lake that night, while rushing her to the hospital. Neither of them survived. Being in a small town, news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers, and I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got into contact and began talking to each other about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now referred to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 3 pages and never mentioned it again. The ship's log never explained anything of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the Rake, and that was the very last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led to us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night, for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling through my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the recording at 8 times the normal speed. This still took almost an hour every day. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to describe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I've heard it before, and now I believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I have not seen the Rake since it ruined my life, but I know that he's been in my room while I slept. I know and fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me. And that is the end of that woman's encounter. Hopefully. This story, as with all other ones found on the internet, once again cause a rift between people that are sure it's a hoax and those that claim that the Rake actually exists. There's no doubt in my mind that some people tell stories to either get attention or further the sightings and the lore of this creature and other ones. But what about the people that have legitimately seen something that looks like a Rake? I mentioned earlier that I have heard and presented numerous accounts where these poor souls encounter something that looks humanoid, but has gray skin and black hollow eyes. My gut tells me that a lot of these people actually saw something, but perhaps they use the term Rake because they don't know what else to call it. Maybe some of these people have encountered a Wendigo. Some of these encounters do happen in the forest, but lots of times Wendigos are described as emaciated. Sometimes they even have antlers. Lots of times, that encounter with Wendigos, they hear their own voices, and these voices are being repeated back to them. If it's not a Wendigo, maybe it's a skinwalker. Skinwalker descriptions do vary. A skinwalker is more likely to come into civilization, though, which is where a lot of encounters that I've read allegedly take place with these Rake creatures. There's also the fact that skinwalkers don't just stalk you in your room. If a skinwalker got in and was at the foot of the bed, you wouldn't be around to tell anybody about it. And again, skinwalkers can usually mimic someone's voice, or at least use human speech to lure a victim out. Both of these creatures are possible, I guess, but not all the descriptions and encounters line up. I do believe that something was stalking Carrie on that episode of Monsters and Mysteries, and I don't think it was a Wendigo for a second. I'm fairly convinced it wasn't a skinwalker either. So, maybe it was an alien. Some species are described as gray, but again, they don't stalk you. If they come into your house, it's to take you, not to give you a death omen. One thing not a lot of people point out is another option. My personal favorite. Maybe it's a tulpa. A thought form. Nothing is more powerful than faith and belief. Could it actually be possible that so many people believed that the Rake was real after it was created on the internet, that it actually was believed into existence? If that's the case, how many monsters and creatures that are seen all over the world came into existence because they were simply believed in by enough people? How scary is that? So whether you believe the Rake to be a hoax, created by the internet, a real flesh and blood creature, some kind of demon, something else, or something new, is up to you to decide. I do believe that something is out there. What it is, I don't know. But something is definitely out there. And now, I'm going to give you more encounters that people believe were an encounter with the Rake. And I want to hear what you think. Do you think it was the Rake? Or do you think it was something else? Tell me what you believe these encounters to be. I think there's something strange living in the woods near my house. I live in a rural area in Mississippi. I won't say exactly where, for privacy reasons. And the area is surrounded by a vast forest that is littered with deer camps and thick trees. I've seen something weird in there since I was 13, but before I get into that, I want to give some context. My family has lived on the property since my grandparents moved there to start a family. My dad and his siblings all grew up there. Then my dad and mom moved into the house next door, and my uncle moved into the house down the street. From there, I lived in the house for the next 18 years before I left for college, and I've since moved to a nearby town. The property holds several acres of dense woodland, hills, and steep embankments. There's several footpaths tracing throughout that lead to deer camps and hunting stands. Some of the paths also lead to hunting camps that belong to other people who live in the area. When I was 13, I was walking along one of these footpaths when I heard a tree branch break and something land with a thud a couple of yards off the path. The thud was loud. This thing sounded heavy. I looked over just in time to see something humanoid barreling off into the forest on all fours. It was naked, and its skin was ghostly white or gray. That was all I could discern. I could only see it for a couple of seconds before it disappeared, and honestly, I was so taken aback that I was in a state of shock at what I had just seen. I didn't see that thing again for several weeks, until I was coming out of the forest through a path behind my grandparents' house. It was raining, and I was running to make it back home, trying not to get wet, when I heard something shuffling around in one of the sheds in my grandparents' backyard. Now, I thought this was weird, considering the sheds were full of clutter and old junk that we didn't even use anymore, so there shouldn't have been anyone in there. I thought maybe somebody was shuffling around trying to find something to take. I looked inside, and that's when I saw what I've come to call the Pale Man up close. It was completely hairless, and crouched down in the piles of junk with its back turned to me. It was very thin, with a human-like body, visible ribs, and strangely long limbs, and that same whitish-gray skin. It looked back over its shoulder at me. I could see that it had deep black eye sockets with wide eyes staring at me. It didn't have any lips, just teeth, and a mouth pulled back in a horrible grimace. There were more teeth than I thought possible. Way more than a human has. It also didn't have a nose. It screeched at me, and that's when I ran back to the house, getting the hell out of there. I told my dad what had happened, but when he looked back to check the shed, gun in hand, he found it completely empty. Then the next sighting, well, it isn't mine, but it still counts because someone else ran into this thing. And I learned this off of complete happenstance. I was participating in a summer work program this past summer, and I struck up a conversation with one of the other participants while we were waiting for orientation to begin. It came up that we were both interested in Native American folklore and urban legends, and then he asked me if I'd ever heard of something called the Rake. Since the rake is the closest thing I've been able to find appearance-wise in regards to what I saw all those years ago, I told him my story. He looked shocked when I told him this, and lamented that he had had a similar experience, and the details that he told me shook me to my core. I couldn't believe the things that he said. It happened in 2014, the same year as my experience. It was deer season, and he was sitting up in his deer stand before the sun had come up. While he was waiting, he heard something scaling the side of his deer stand, which stood 15 feet in the air. He looked over and saw a skeletal face peering into the window. This thing, whatever it was clinging to the side of his stand. It climbed up there with no problem. Could have been because of the claws that were at the ends of each hand. Whatever it was, this guy startled it, and it fell to the ground. He heard it thump against the ground, and watched it limp off into the forest. He described it as looking like the Wendigos from the game Until Dawn, a point I also made to my college friend who introduced me to the game. I asked him if he could take me to the place he saw it, but he said he doesn't visit that stand anymore because he's too afraid. I still asked him the general area that it was in, so I could drive through the area and see if I could find anything on my own. And he did give me an answer. And this is what really startled me. I can't give the exact address, again for privacy reasons, but my house was directly on the intersection of those two roads that he gave me. That means that whatever he saw was in the general vicinity of the thing that I saw. I didn't get any more information from him, but I suspect that it happened at one of those deer camps that are connected to my property. This spurred me to look into the matter a bit more seriously. I considered myself an amateur paranormal investigator at that point, and I'd been going on searches throughout the area in the previous weeks. Every now and then, I'll hear something really big walking out of sight in the forest nearby. It's either obscured by the trees or on the opposite side of a hill that I'm walking around. Somehow, whatever this thing is, always stays out of sight. It'll walk in sync with me, but when I stop walking, I'll hear it take a few steps before it stops, restarting only when I start walking again. An incident happened like this not too long ago, when I heard it trailing directly behind me as I made my way following a small creek just off of one of these paths. There was a steep hill on my right side, and I walked around the hill and started going the opposite direction. I could still hear this creature on the other side of the hill. I looked up, and I thought I saw something humanoid moving on the top of the hill, ducking to hide behind one of the thick trees up there. The hill was too steep for me to climb up to the top and investigate, so I missed out on that opportunity. I'm not 100% sure that I actually saw something in the instance, but it was just a fleeting glimpse. I do know this though, I didn't hear any more footsteps following me after I saw that thing. I went for a full-blown stakeout after that. I camped in a clearing next to a deer stand, which is only a couple hundred yards from where my friend had his sighting, and an even shorter distance to where I had my own. I revisited the area where I had my first sighting, and saw something that piqued my curiosity. The area is full of very steep hills and washouts where rain erodes the dirt between these hills, making the area pretty precarious. There was a downward slope just off the path where I had my encounter, and I saw a collection of sticks stacked together against a tree in the washout. I actually climbed down into the washout to investigate this further. And the sticks, they were assembled almost like a lean-to against the tree, but they also curved kind of in this bowl shape. It looked like something had woven together a nest out of twigs, and something the size of a man could fit into it. It also used larger branches, sometimes 3 inches thick, to strengthen this structure. I don't know about you, but I don't know of any local animal that could have built something like this, unless there's a Sasquatch around the area too. But I doubt that, because this thing definitely does not look like a Sasquatch. And whatever this structure was, I don't think it was naturally occurring at all. If this was the work of the Pale Man, I don't think he used it recently. I couldn't find any bones or droppings or footprints or even any signs of something actually living in this structure. Then I returned to my tent and watched the area until the sun went down and I went to sleep, planning to wake around 3 a.m. to perform my stakeout. When the time came, I stayed inside my tent and looked out into the night through my tent window. I soon discovered that it was incredibly hard to see in this much darkness, something that I didn't really take into account. I couldn't see anything clearly far beyond my tent. I did see something, however, some indiscernible shape situated at the base of two conjoined trees. It was way too far away for me to discern what exactly it was, but I know it was about 2 to 3 feet tall. Now I'm sure you're wondering why I didn't use a flashlight, to which my answer is the only one I have available. The only flashlight I had was my cell phone. It wouldn't have been strong enough to even reach whatever was nesting at the base of that tree. And if the creature was watching me from nearby, a flashlight certainly would have alerted it, and I was afraid of distressing it and possibly causing it to attack. Although, admittedly, in the times it's been following me through the woods, it never seemed keen on actually attacking me. It just seems to be curiously observing, just out of sight. Either way, I kept my eyes locked on this shape for several minutes, and it didn't move an inch. After about half an hour of nothing happening, I determined that what I was staring at must have been a bush that looked weird in the complete darkness. I was too tired, and what animal could have possibly kept still for that long? Soon after that, I fell asleep, and I woke at 8 the next morning. While I was packing up my things, I looked at the two trees where the thing rested beside it the night before, and to my shock, there was absolutely nothing there. Not a bush, not a tree stump. The spot where I saw something was completely barren. Maybe there actually was something watching me. I don't know. I don't know if it means anything. I don't know if anything happened, or if it was a trick of the eyes, or what have you. This is just what I noticed. Whatever I saw closely resembles the rake. In fact, that's really the only thing I've been able to find that matches up with it. That being said, it's very difficult to find any reliable information on the matter. Most things I research say the rake is completely fictional and was made up by a couple of kids a long time ago saying, "Let's make a new monster." So I figured I'd come here, one of the best channels I know. I'll be continuing my searches throughout the area, and I will be continuing my stakeouts. Anything I find, I'll send to you. I want to know what this thing is. On the subject of theories, someone had suggested that it could possibly be a hairless chimpanzee, but, joking aside, I don't believe that this is the case. The thing I saw was a very different shade of grayish white, and wasn't as muscular as you'd find chimpanzees to be. It looked very thin and fragile. It didn't look particularly strong, plus it was much taller in comparison. On top of that, I haven't seen anything resembling chimpanzee footprints in the area. Which is another thing that I wanted to point out. I've never seen any footprints of this creature. I've only ever seen deer, hog, raccoon, and the occasional coyote footprint in those woods. To top it off, that gaping mouth with all those teeth and those hollow black eyes. It wasn't a chimpanzee. I don't know exactly what it was, but I know it wasn't a chimpanzee. And on the topic of not finding any footprints, I believe there's possibly a reason for that as well. I think this creature, this rake, might be chiefly arboreal. It's already shown that it has a knack for climbing. The first time I saw it, it had either jumped or fallen out of a tree, indicating to me that it had been traveling through the treetops to begin with, and my friend said it climbed all the way up to the side of his deer stand, which would have been no easy feat, I imagine. Even if this creature did occasionally travel on the ground, the distance between any given set of footprints it would leave behind would be very outstretched, and would make tracking this thing extremely difficult. With all that said, I would really like your opinions on this matter. Okay, so I thought someone here might be able to give me some help on what this thing might be, why it might be there, and what's actually going on. This all is still happening, and honestly it's starting to freak me right the hell out. I'd also like to add that my boyfriend has suggested that maybe the thing could be a rake or something similar to that. He's not very helpful when it comes to calming me down over these things, and saying things like it could be a rake just freaks me out even more. It all started about 4 years ago, when I moved to a new estate. The house was bigger, with 3 bedrooms, and both a front and backyard. I'd like to point out that my room is at the back of the house, the only bedroom that's facing the woods actually, and the only room that can actually see into the woods clearly, as the living room view is obscured by a fence. There's also a park, I guess if you could call it that, just down the street from my house, not even a 2-minute walk, that comes into play later in this story. When this all started, I just brushed it off. Whenever I'd be in the house alone, I'd feel vulnerable, like I was being watched. But that's normal for a 13-year-old child at the time, right? To feel like when you're home alone, somebody's there watching you, or some monster's gonna break through the door. So I paid little attention to it, and I just played some Assassin's Creed. This feeling went on for a few years, mainly when I entered my room. I'd enter my room and I'd feel freezing immediately, even on the hottest days of summer. But again, I would just brush this off. It was just a draft, right? Well, skip 2 years and things started to get weird. I'm 16 now, and though I'd like to believe I've grown tougher, I still get scared shitless by the smallest of things, so this terrified me. I was hanging out with some friends, Rebecca and Caitlin, and we decided to head down to the park. It was pretty late, so it was getting quite dark, and we wanted to watch the last few moments of the sunset. We got to the park and walked through nearly empty fields to sit on some kind of log pylon things. After a few minutes, we all noted the sudden feeling of dread that seemed to wash over all 3 of us. Even though we brushed it all off, we joked about how it was just a feeling and how if you think it's a ghost, we should get out of here. We threw all those ideas around and we just laughed, telling each other that we were just freaking each other out. But Becca was the first to stop laughing, saying that we should go. Now. I was all for that, because at this point, even freaking myself out and my friends freaking me out, my imagination was starting to run wild, and I just wanted to get out of there. I jumped down from that pylon thing, but refused to walk without them. And that's how I described it. This feeling of dread. It just came over me. I didn't want to be the first one to walk away. That's how the first person dies in a horror movie after all, right? And I'd be damned if that was going to be me. Caitlin, who's usually the most talkative one of all of us, was strangely quiet at this point, slowly climbing down from the pylon and seemingly reluctantly looking away from this tunnel that was about 4 to 5 meters away from where we sat. We started to walk around these large trees as we headed out of the park, and Becca began to speed up. She recently told me that it was because she felt like something was walking behind her, very close behind her. Being the stubborn and idiotic teenagers we were, we decided to just sit on a patch of grass by the gate of the park and refused to talk about the feelings which were still really hanging over us like some kind of dark omen or something. Caitlin decided to roll a cigarette and got her lighter ready. Laying it out on the grass, she went to work, but once she finished, me and Becca were getting too agitated to sit there and smoke with her, so we decided to leave the park and sit by the wall leading to the estate. Caitlin pulled out her unlit cigarette once we sat down. About to smoke it, she realized she'd left her cigarette lighter at the park. Well, shit. Both of them, still not mentioning why they'd been so fixated on this tunnel, were reluctant to go back to get the lighter. Becca even more so. I promise you'll understand why later. I was just terrified. After having some time to calm down and put the strange feelings down to the creepy park at night, we decided to head back for the damn lighter. You know that feeling of shock you get when you throw cold water over your face? Well, that's near the exact feeling we got stepping through the gate of the park. Walking up to it, we were perfectly happy, almost having completely forgotten the matter. But the moment we stepped into that park again, we felt that heavy, sickly, fearful feeling like we were being watched again. Now, I just put this part down to an overactive imagination and fear, and maybe even my eyes playing tricks on me in the dark, but I could have sworn I saw something run by the tree, the one Becca got the feeling of being followed by. I voiced my concerns to my friends, and the general response was, yeah, screw that. Caitlin grabbed the lighter and we got the hell out of there, not wanting to confirm whether what I was seeing was real or my imagination. After the park, we headed back to our spot at the entrance of the estate. I managed to convince Caitlin to let me have the last few drags of her cigarette because I was still feeling really creeped out. Once we got back home, we were getting changed when Caitlin noticed some bruises on her leg. but they weren't normal. It was like she'd been grabbed, but she hadn't done anything that day to result in her being hurt or injured, and she's the least superstitious person that I know. But after returning to the park a couple of times, experiencing the same feeling of dread and receiving the same bruises, even she began to admit that this wasn't something normal at all. Both of them ended up telling me that they'd seen something in the tunnel. Caitlin saw a white light, whereas Becca saw a face, but not a human one. She says the outline was dimly lit, but there seemed to be a white ring around where its eyes should be. I'd also like to mention that both prior to this and afterwards, I've been seeing these weird lights and hearing whistling sounds in the woods behind my house. The lights change from green to red rather quickly, but they're never in the same spot the next night, and there's no pattern as to where they appear. The whistling freaks me out a whole lot more though. The pitch of the notes changes in some sort of creepy tune, and I get the feeling that I should go check it out, but I know better. It's like that whistling is trying to draw me into the woods. The whistling also changes its location on each note. It'll be at the edge of the woods, then deep in the woods, then by the fence and at the front of the house, even below my window. I always close my window because my boyfriend mentioned that if it is a spirit, then to do absolutely nothing, that seems like I could be inviting it in. I don't want to give it power by admitting that it's real. I don't know if spirits take an open window as an invitation, but I'm not taking any chances. Plus, the closed window makes me feel a lot safer. And then skip to a while later. The feeling of being watched continues, though no lights recently in the woods and I haven't heard the whistling in almost a month. Great, right? No. I was coming back from a meeting with some missionaries, people from the church for those who don't know. I was with my boyfriend, who's Wiccan, and on the way home he wanted to cut through the park to see if he could feel or see anything. He'd been fascinated ever since I told him the story of what me and Caitlin and Becca saw that night, but I never wanted to go back. Obviously, when he wanted to go there, I was quite opposed to the idea, but being a stupid, lovesick teenager, I couldn't just say no to him, even over something as silly as this. We entered the park through a rocky rubble area that was filled with all this crap on the main road. Once we entered the park, I got the same feeling of dread, mixed with anticipation, and out of fear, I started singing. I know it's strange, I know, but it helped. I passed the tunnel, and everything was fine. My boyfriend didn't feel scared at all, and couldn't sense anything with his witchy ways. He held my hand to try to calm me down. It didn't really work. We passed the trees on the opposite side of where me, Becca, and Caitlin had walked all those months prior, and he tripped slightly, but didn't fall completely. He glanced up after regaining his balance and started to pull me along towards the gate, only whispering to me not to panic and to walk a little faster. I walked faster, and I also continued to sing, beginning to stumble over my words. Why was he so scared? I wanted to know, but I was afraid to ask. We just about reached the gate when he spoke again, but wouldn't look at me. He just kept looking forward, and he continued to drag me along, practically crushing my hand in the process. And then he told me that when he looked up, he saw something perched in the tree. He couldn't distinguish any features, but the body looked human, but not all at the same time. It was unnaturally tall, with long, thin arms and legs, and it appeared to be watching us. At this point, I was shaking. We'd walked right past whatever the hell that thing was, and I'm quite glad that I didn't see it, because I would have had an undoubtable scream coming out of my mouth instead of those song lyrics. That could have resulted in us not making it much further past the tree. We got home, and he noticed his side was hurting, so he lifted his shirt up, and he had a large number of long, deep scratches on his right side. My first and only response was, "What in the hell happened?" The direction in which the scratches were going meant that he would have had to have been walking backwards next to something sharp, which, obviously, he hadn't done anything like that. It's like that creature that he saw in the tree manifested those wounds on him, just like it manifested the bruises. That's everything that's happened so far, and believe me, you'll be hearing from me if anything else happens. But for now, I'm just gonna stay clear of that park. What do you think this thing is? And why is it progressively getting more active, and apparently more violent? My boyfriend's into all that kind of stuff. Cryptids and vampires and all those creepy things. He told me that it was something called a rake. I looked it up, and from what I could tell, these things were supposed to be fake. They were created on the internet, right? I read that it could be a skinwalker or a crawler or something too. But he's certain that what we saw that night was a rake. And he's certain that what we experienced that night without him was a rake too. He thinks it was the same creature and that it stalks that park and that tunnel. It probably goes around those wooded areas looking for food. I don't want to know what it eats. But I guess it's up to us to figure out what it is. But I really don't want to know because I don't want to have any more run-ins with this thing. I've never saw that thing myself, but I believe the people around me that say that they experienced what they did. And I definitely believe that my boyfriend saw something perched in that tree. Any help or advice on what this thing could be and how to stay away from it would really, really help. Because it's getting to the point where I don't even want to look out my window that faces those woods anymore. I would hate to look out there and see that thing perched in a tree by my house. Or when that whistling starts again, to look out the window and see it standing right there at the window, trying to draw me out. Thank you for listening. I'm starting to believe that there's things out there that shouldn't be. As you put it, things that go bump in the night. This took place in Missouri, just this past summer. I'm 35, and I've always loved the horror genre, but honestly, I've been very skeptical about any of it actually being real. I guess I've always wanted to believe in vampires, and werewolves, and ghosts, and everything else, but I never actually did. Until last June. I have a chihuahua named Tucker, who had just turned 2 that June. I don't have a fenced-in yard, so I have to walk him for potty breaks. Since he's a small dog, he goes potty every 4 to 6 hours, even in the middle of the night. So it's common for me to be out walking at 1, 2, or even 3 a.m. sometimes. When I'm walking my dog, I use my flashlight on my phone so I can see to pick up his poop. Anyway, we're in my backyard, and we're headed towards the back of the property line. There's a chain link fence separating the backyard from my neighbor's yard. Along the fence there's some bushes, then a gap of just fence, and then a cluster of trees. As we're by the bushes, headed towards the trees, Tucker suddenly stops and whimpers, hackles raised. He doesn't usually act like this. Usually he's a pretty happy dog. Usually he even wags a tail at strangers just waiting to be loved. So I tilt my phone up so the light is shining on the fence in the tree area, which is about 15 feet in front of me at this point. And then, what I saw made me scream, because it was something out of my nightmares. Something out of those scary movies that I only thought were imaginary. Perched on the fence, looking straight at me, is some kind of gray creature. I have no words for it. This thing was huge. It looked kind of human-shaped, I guess, but was really thin, without any type of hair or fur anywhere on its entire body. This thing had to be at least as tall as me, 5'8", and very, very skinny. Think this emaciated human kind of skinny, but not human at all. I remember it having a very protruded spine. Its skin was a very light gray color, and it looked almost shimmery, or I guess after talking to you, I could describe it as wet? No hair anywhere on the body, just like I said. The head was human-shaped, but slightly larger. It must have just looked bigger because it was so skinny, though. Maybe the eyes and the head were proportionate to its body, I don't know. The eyes were almost almond-shaped, but a bit bigger than human size, I guess. And they were all black. Jet black. It didn't have a human nose, though. It was almost flat where the nose should be, although I could see slits that I suppose were nostrils. It didn't look to have lips either. Just a straight line for a mouth. It was closed, so I didn't see any teeth, but from other encounters that I've read about, there were definitely teeth in that mouth. I didn't see ears. There may have been ear holes, but honestly, I don't remember if I actually saw that or if my brain is just trying to fill in gaps and make sense of what I saw. I just for sure remember that there were no ears protruding out, and no tail either. This creature stared at me for 2 or 3 seconds, and then it leapt off of the fence into the neighbor's yard. The thing is, though, when it jumped, it bounded through the yard like it was on all fours. It didn't act aggressive or make any noise. If anything, it was almost like I caught this thing off guard. It just stared at me for a few seconds and leapt off the fence. The only thing was, the fence was rattling, like it was about to give in underneath this thing's weight. In fact, the only sounds I heard that entire time were the rattling of the fence when it jumped off, and Tucker whimpering. That creature, it didn't make any sound at all. When it ran, it almost looked like a wolf running, but this thing was definitely not wolf-shaped. It was way more human-shaped than animal-shaped. It bounded through the neighbor's yard and leapt over their fence towards the front yard. It cleared the fence easily. I don't know how the hell it ran through the yard so fast either. It was hands down the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. And this whole time, poor Tucker was crying and trying to pull me towards our house. But like I said, he's a small dog, so he wasn't pulling me anywhere. And I think for a minute, I was so caught off guard by what I saw that I was frozen to the spot. Like my brain and my body couldn't process what was going on. And so I didn't flee in terror like I should have. But then, finally, that instinct kicked in, and we turned and scrambled inside faster than I've ever moved. My heart was beating harder than it ever had, and my mind was twirling. My brain was in chaos. I couldn't make sense of what I just saw. Honestly, I still can't. Ever since this happened, I started having other strange encounters or events as well. Mostly when I'm walking Tucker at night. I've started to become a true believer in the paranormal. It's so confusing though, because I've always been so skeptical. But I know that what I've been seeing, it just can't be explained by anything rational. I don't know. As far as other encounters, it's mostly been having very strong feelings of fear come out of nowhere, especially at night when I'm walking Tucker. I don't know if it's my body reacting to that thing, or if it's something else. It just happens sporadically, and I can't figure out what sets it off. It also happens to Tucker. We'll be walking and everything is fine. Then he'll look over between some houses or something, and his hackles will raise just like that night, and he'll cower behind me crying. Like I said, he's usually such a happy dog. When this happens, he'll try to run away. Normally, if he sees a person or a rabbit or squirrel, he'll go after it in a happy way. He'll move towards it, not cower or hide or run. The nights when he does that, I listen to him. I listen to my instincts. I turn around and I go right the hell home, because I don't want to see that thing again. That time I got off lucky. Maybe I scared it, and it had to run away. Maybe it doesn't mean any harm, maybe it does. I don't want to find out. And then this other time, we were walking our normal route, and we passed by this sewer drain. We heard the most terrifying scream/moan that I've ever heard. I know every time I describe this creature, there's something about every time I've ever seen it or heard it that's been the scariest or weirdest thing I've ever seen, but it's true. You don't know what these things are. You encounter them, and parts of your brain try to rationalize what you've seen, but there's nothing to rationalize. These creatures are from a completely different world. But this scream that was in the sewer, it sounded like it was straight out of a horror movie, and it was so loud. Tucker jumped so far, and we immediately both started running. I was absolutely terrified. Not as afraid as the one night when I saw that thing, but still damn terrified. Ever since then, when we get close to that specific sewer drain, Tucker will swing out wide away from it. He used to stop and sniff it and look every time we walked by, but now he won't go within 5 feet of the thing no matter what, even during the day. It's wild. Everything about this encounter is just wild. I'm a 20-year-old guy from Illinois. I've been in the woods my entire life. In fact, my dad brought me hunting for the first time when I was 4 years old. And no, he didn't give me a gun then. He just let me sit in the stand with him. Since then, I have been in love with all things outdoors, along with firearms and the like. I mainly bow hunt, for everything from deer to squirrel, but will often take my .22 out for coon or squirrel hunting. This event took place about a year ago when I was 19, and my friend Ryan was 17. Ryan and I were at his house, which sat on a 10-acre plot of land, but was surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands of acres that we had free reign over, so long as we didn't tear apart his neighbor's corn or beans on our dirt bikes. We spent almost every weekend out in those woods, either riding dirt bikes, hunting, or fishing in the farm ponds, so we knew the area and the animals in the area very well. We very often even went out very late at night to coon hunt or coyote hunt, and this is how our story starts. We were planning on taking his coonhound, Banjo, out to get some coons because we were pretty bored, but we ended up hanging out in the back of their barn that was built into a man cave, just watching TV and hanging out with his dad. That day I brought my AR-15 to his house to sight it in with the new sight that I'd put on it, so I had it next to me in the man cave. We always had at least one gun easily accessible, just in case we heard Banjo out in his doghouse barking, because they had a chicken coop, and sometimes they would get coons or coyotes to try and get a midnight snack. This night, it was about 1 a.m. Ryan was passed out on the couch, and I was just watching Family Guy, half asleep, when I heard Banjo start to bark. I sat there thinking about how I didn't want to get out of the recliner to find out that he was barking at something stupid, but I figured it was better than Ryan's mom yelling at us about a missing rooster or chicken if there really was a coyote or a raccoon trying to get into the coop. So I got up, grabbed the AR-15, which still had about 10 rounds in the magazine, clicked on the light I had attached to the rail, and walked out the door, leaving Ryan passed out on the couch. When I walked to the back door, I had to walk around another shed to be within 50 yards of the coop. So I walked around and started heading towards the coop, not really paying attention much, until I realized that Banjo had stopped barking. Then the realization that I didn't hear the bullfrogs or crickets or any other wildlife, to be honest. That spooked me, because that meant something big and dangerous was in the area. Also, being a big fan of cryptid stories and horror stories in general, this put me on edge, and my imagination started to run wild. I never thought in a million years I would run into something that I did that night. I started scanning the tree line with my light, not knowing what to expect. Half expecting to find nothing, since usually if we were heading out there, whatever was trying to get into the coop would skedaddle before we could pull the trigger. But then, my light shined on Banjo's enclosure. There was this pale, white creature leaning over the 4-foot-high fencing that they used for his area, looking right at the doghouse. Banjo was in there, shivering. Whatever this creature was, terrified the poor dog. This thing didn't look like anything that I've ever seen in my entire life, and it matched perfectly with the description of what everybody out there calls the Rake. When the light shone on it, it turned its head and looked at me. In that moment, my blood ran cold. I will never, ever forget those dead eyes. They were pure black. The light from the flashlight beam glistened over them. It was the black of a shark's eyes. It looked like there was nothing there. It didn't have a nose. It didn't look like it even had lips. It had this mouth full of teeth. Those eyes. That mouth. I still have nightmares of those things. This thing stood straight up. It looked to be at least 8 inches taller than me. And I'm a big guy. 6'4". I stared into those eyes and it stared right back at me. And this creature, it didn't make any noise. This was the first time in my life that I was legitimately frozen from fear. I couldn't move. And this thing was just staring down at me while making this really low growling noise that finally started. It started off a quiet growl, and then it got louder. It was something I've never heard before. After what had to have been 30 seconds or so, I regained a little control. I raised my gun, thinking there's no way that I would take this thing down. whatever it was, just wishing that I had my 12-gauge slug gun with me. I shot one round and missed because I was so freaked out. Then I emptied whatever was left in my magazine. I had to have hit it at least once because it screamed. This sort of howl mixed with the most horrid sort of scream that I've ever heard. I can't even think of how to truly describe it. And then this thing ran off on two legs back into the trees. The way it moved was just disturbing. It was unnatural. It ran off, and then Ryan came sprinting out of the barn with his dad's 1911 pistol, looking around frantically and asking me what the hell that was. I just stood there, staring towards the trees where that thing ran off to, and without looking at Ryan, I just said, almost under my breath, "We have to get inside, right now." I spent the rest of the night clutching the 12-gauge that I finally got my hands on, the same one I wished that I had earlier. The next morning I told Ryan what I'd seen, and him being a believer in cryptids, luckily he believed me, and agreed that we were lucky that night, because everything that he's ever heard of any creature like this, whether that be a Wendigo, a crawler, a fleshgate, or this Rake, any of those could have easily killed us. We continued to hunt at night, though, using Banjo, who luckily also survived the ordeal. We'd go out and tree coons for another 10 months or so before I moved to Minnesota for work reasons. I never saw that thing again, but I know what I saw. I worry for Ryan and the rest of his family down there, and I hope they never see that thing either. They stay vigilant. When they go outside when Banjo barks for the coop, they always go together, and they're always well armed. Every once in a while, they think that that thing might still be around, just because the forest goes silent again. Ryan remembers that part of my story, and although there could just be some natural predator around, they don't take their chances, because luckily the rest of the family believes my story too. This story involves myself and my girlfriend. At the time, I was 20, she was 18. This took place in a nowhere town in the middle of North Carolina. I was living with a friend at the time, as I had nowhere to really go and was saving up for my own apartment due to reasons irrelevant to the story. And my girlfriend typically stayed the night with me, as we had an entire basement and bedroom to ourselves, and my friend didn't really mind, as we were all close and still are to this day. I was a pretty heavy smoker at the time and went outside to take my habit away from the house, to which my girlfriend would follow to partake as well. So like any other time that my nicotine craving set in, I would grab my lighter from the bedside table and go ahead out into the driveway. For context on this place, my friend lived out in the middle of BFE, around some forest and some country roads, and several farms. He had a pretty sizable yard in the front which led to this road, and the only place really opened around those parts was a gas station that you could walk to in about 5 minutes. Anything else was a good 15 to 20 minutes away. Anyways, as I head outside, my girlfriend behind me, the two of us having a pretty light-hearted conversation, inside jokes and whatnot, before something catches my eye near my vehicle, which was parked under his old oak tree near the center of his yard in the driveway. I'm sure everyone knows the feeling of trying to focus on something that you feel isn't supposed to be there, so you tune everything else out. Everything around you just kind of blurs out while you're trying to figure out what the hell it is that you're looking for, or what's going on, right? Well, beside my car, there was this thing crouched down, akin to how a cat or dog would sit. It's about 11 p.m. at this point, so it was dark, and the porch light wasn't really reaching far enough to get a good look at it, but this is what I could make out. It had long arms that, despite being in front of it, the elbows pointed back behind it. There were no visible hairs or fur anywhere that I could see, and this thing had a large bulbous head, and it looked like, to what I'm guessing, could have been a large mouth? I don't know, maybe that was just a trick of the light, but from what I've read on these creatures, a large mouth definitely comes with the territory. I'm not entirely sure about the size, as I was still at a distance away and it was crouched down beside my vehicle, but it looked like if it stood up, it could be about my height. I'm 6'1". Hell, Maybe it could have even been taller. As soon as I started to piece together what I was staring at, I realized my girlfriend had begun questioning me, calling out my name and walking to my side. Instinctively, I blocked her with my arm and told her to get back inside as I continued staring at this thing, which made no effort to turn and look at us, and it just remained unmoving. She gave this sort of laugh, assuming that I was messing with her, which isn't unlike me. I do like practical jokes, but this time I was dead serious. She began trying to look at what I was so focused on, and that's when she realized that I wasn't joking, because she caught sight of it too, and I remember her asking me, "What in the hell is that?" Fear just full in her voice. I had no words to answer her, but this confirmed that what I was seeing was entirely real. In a panic, we both start backing towards the door, still garnering no reaction from this thing at my car until we're at the door, fumbling for the knob and then finally getting inside. After we're inside, she asked me what it was again, but I still had no idea. After we head back down to the basement, she decides to sketch this thing. She wanted to remember what it looked like. She wanted to tell me all the details so she could see if what I saw and what she saw were the same thing. We could line up exactly what she saw together. A few minutes later, I'm looking at this thing on paper. It was exactly what I saw. A bulbous head, long arms with the elbows arched behind it, crouching down. It was this sickly gray color. I still don't know if what I saw was a mouth. She doesn't remember seeing a mouth. But we're both pretty sure that what we saw that night was a rake. It's been a good 5 years since then. We moved into our own apartment, away from that area. I'm doubtful she still has the drawing, but if I close my eyes, I could still see that creature. I've had a lot of nightmares about that thing, especially after I researched what it was, or what it could be. I read about different sightings of different creatures. A rake fits the bill. I don't know if these things come from around here, or if they come from another planet or another dimension, but I do know that they're here now. I do know that I saw it. I know that it didn't hurt us. Hell, it didn't even pay any attention to us. I think it was looking at something else, like its attention was drawn out into the woods. From what else I've read, these things can be malicious, but they can also be curious. Maybe they're like us. Maybe some are good and some are bad. Who knows? I hope I never figure it out, because I hope I never see this thing again. Like I said, we moved far away from that area. I told my friend what we saw. Not too sure he believes me, but I think he believes me enough to be cautious outside now, so I'm grateful for that. I would also be grateful for anybody that could mention what they think it would be, or what it could be. That's all the encounter that I have. I thank you for sharing it, and I thank you for everybody that listens and takes the time to try to help me figure out what this thing was. So this took place back in 2012 when my then boyfriend lived in Sweden. I live in Canada, and he came to visit me. During one of those evenings that he was there, I woke up in the middle of the night to what I saw was something horrifying. It was sitting at the foot of the bed. It was pale, thin, and humanoid, but it was completely hairless. It seemed to walk on all fours despite looking like a human figure. I couldn't see much of its face since it was looking away from me, but what I did see was that it looked a lot like a creature that they call the Rake. Although it's my understanding that the Rake is fictional. But I can assure you what I saw was most definitely real. I gasped and screamed, and it hopped off the bed and into the darkness. My partner woke up to ask me what the hell was wrong, but I didn't tell him because I didn't want to scare him. And then in 2014, he was visiting me again. And once again, this thing came to us as we slept. He was the one to see it this time, though. I woke up to hear him screaming, like I've never heard him before. Usually he's very brave, but those screams, they were just filled with pure terror. I immediately turned on the light and shook him to try and snap him out of it, but he just screamed and then started to cry. After 30 minutes or so, he was finally calm enough to explain what happened. Apparently, he woke up to a pale humanoid figure with a gaping mouth and black, sunken eyes, basically sitting on top of him. As he screamed, the figure slowly backed itself into the closet on all fours and was staring at him the whole time. After he told me this, I went back to 2 years prior, and those feelings of terror overwhelmed me again. I felt sick. You see, to that day I never told him about what I saw all those years ago. There was no way he could have known or described what I saw so perfectly unless he saw that creature too. We've since broken up, but we've kept in close contact. And here's why I'm writing you. Because this thing seems to be showing up again. My ex messaged me and told me how his girlfriend had seen that entity. But they were half a world away. They weren't at my place this time. They were asleep, and apparently she woke up to see this thing stalking around the room. It noticed her, frozen in fear, so it crawled up next to her. My ex woke up to her screaming, just as scared as he had been, just as scared as I had been. He tried to console her, not knowing what was going on. And then she described what she saw to him. A pale gray humanoid creature. No hair, black eyes, a gaping mouth. He was dumbfounded. And again, that terror that he felt, that I felt, washed over him again. He looked around the room and the rest of their house, making sure that that thing wasn't there, gun in his hand. Not that I think a gun would do anything to this creature. What we saw was the exact same thing, worlds apart. The only thing is, she didn't know about that experience either. She'd never heard from either of us about these experiences. Is it just a coincidence of mass hallucination while waking up that the three of us see the exact same thing? Or is it a demon, or skinwalker, or the Rake that's following us? I'm totally freaked out. I don't know what to do, and I don't know what it wants. Sometimes I hear of encounters where these things talk to you, but it hasn't talked to any of us. It's just been there, watching us sleep. And then when we wake up and freak out, it disappears. I don't know what to do at this point. I'm scared that the next time this thing comes, it's gonna come in my place, and I'm gonna see it again. One encounter is enough. I don't know if I could shake a second one. But I think that maybe it's attached to my ex, because each time an encounter has happened, he's been there. So maybe it's stalking him. And myself and his new girlfriend were just unlucky enough to have woken up before he did and see this creature. I don't want anything to happen to him either. I would like to know what this creature wants with whoever it is that it's really stalking. But I also never want any of us to have an encounter with it again, so maybe we won't learn what this thing is or what it wants, and honestly, if it never comes back, I think that's an even trade of not knowing what it wants. So I live in a very quiet country that not a lot of people even know about, and where nothing really interesting ever happens. Until one night, when I encountered something that I can't explain. It's a Saturday night, or rather, Sunday morning, last summer. My best friend and I are walking back to my place, where she'd be sleeping over after a night of partying in the city. It seems like the usual walking home routine. Everything's quiet, the city's asleep except for a few cars that pass us on the way. We decided to take a shortcut. It goes through the woods and along the old school. We should have never taken that shortcut. As we walk towards the open gate to the school, that's almost hidden by these big bushes, I grabbed my friend's arm and stopped walking, because I saw something was moving behind the bushes, and then quickly hid from us, like it didn't want us to see it. Now, at this point, I can't really decide whether I'm just drunk or if it's reality, so I asked my friend if she saw anything, and she gives me this weird look and says that she didn't see anything. So I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. We walk a few steps closer, but we're still a safe distance of meters away from this thing, when all of a sudden, it shows itself. It peeks its head up from behind the bush. It was incredibly white. It had no face. It looked like it was wearing one of those tight, creepy, white top-to-toe Slenderman suits, only this was definitely not a suit. It knows that I've seen it at this point, so it seems to try to hide better and hurries behind another bush. I can see it though while it was moving across the tiny street into another bush. It's extremely skinny, hairless. All of its bones are clearly showing, and it has a very hunched back. Its way of moving I can only compare to a gorilla, but smoother and more abnormal. This thing was definitely not a creature that should have been around my part of the world, or in this world at all. And then it peeked its head up again from one of the bushes a couple of times, and I quickly grab my friend and we run the other way as my heart is racing and almost beating right out of my chest. I had tears streaming down my face because I was so scared. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of true fear before. And the weirdest, most uncomfortable thing is, my friend never saw this creature. For a couple of months I just brushed it off as some weird dude who had dressed up and liked to scare people, but a couple of days ago I unintentionally came across this link on the internet about a creature. It's called the Rake. I'd never heard of it before, but I'm very sure to this day that the thing that I saw was the Rake, even though I couldn't see its face in the early morning darkness. Though it says the Rake is completely made up, I don't think so. I think people accidentally made up an already existing creature. Or maybe somebody saw this creature and decided to take credit for creating something new. The Rake hasn't shown itself to me again, thank God. Since that day I never take that shortcut again, not even with friends or in the daylight, and I warn people not to take that shortcut, because there's something out there. Most people don't believe me, but some of the people take my advice, and I think that maybe one day I'll save somebody's life. I know the encounters with this creature are few and far between, but if anybody else has an encounter with this thing, I'd be very interested to hear what you saw. Did you click on the link to view my book? If you haven't, you probably should. I guarantee you won't regret it. It's a hell of a story. Nighty night, creatures of the night. And remember, don't miss your chance to scream.